All right, so so we're going to record the presentation only, but the discussion will not be recorded. So let's start. So again, thank you so much for being here for our fourth meeting of the Community Advisory Group for the Resilient Neponset project. This will be our agenda. We're going to talk about the project and where we are to date. We're then going to hear from Barry from MAPC to talk about their community climate liaison project. And then we'll have some time to sort of reflect on that project, the model, and how that might fit into your own work with your own organizations. And then we'll talk about next steps. So.
And it will fall apart.
I'm sorry?
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Side conversation.
Oh. All right, so this is our fourth meeting, and I'm so glad that some of us were able to join in person. When we talked last meeting, it sounded like that was something that people wanted to do, so maybe we'll try this again for the next meeting as well. But what we've done is, during the first meeting, we sort of did a very brief overview of climate impacts in the Neponset region and sort of what the consequences of those climate impacts are, and what broadly, what general activities we can engage in to build resilience in our communities. We also sort of polled participants to find out what was of most interest to you. What do you want to learn more about? What would be most meaningful to your groups? And so the first presentation we had at our second meeting was about green infrastructure and a lot of the green infrastructure projects that are going on in Boston, which is greening up spaces that have been really built and paved over. And so Boston has been doing some great work trying to transform some of those really busy intersections, for example, greening them up with rain gardens that are designed to capture and clean the water instead of having it run off those paved surfaces. And it's got the co-benefit of providing some cooling, right? Some local cooling. You don't have all of that heat radiating down onto the pavement and then being reflected back up to everybody who lives in the neighborhood. At the next meeting, we talked about heat resilient strategies being planned and implemented in Boston. And we heard from Zoe Davis at Climate Ready Boston, who talked about some of the strategies that they plan to implement, particularly at events, and some of the work they're doing in the neighborhoods with tree planting, et cetera, to really try to bring some cooling again to those areas that are really built up. And parallel to these meetings, we are also meeting with municipal staff through the Resilient Neponset Climate Collaborative. And what we're working on with them is sort of trying to identify the plans that they've already made and figure out how they can work together and how we can bridge these two groups to make sure that everybody's talking to each other. We want to make sure that the plans that the municipalities are engaging in are reflective of what residents want and need, and we want to make sure that that the residents are involved in a meaningful way in this planning before these projects get implemented. When we surveyed this group about what you were most interested in, top of the list was nature-based strategies to reduce local temperatures and storm flooding, which is why those first two meetings addressed those. Keeping cool during heat waves, improving communication for municipalities ahead of severe storms, so storm preparedness, managing basement flooding, and the impact of climate change to insurance coverage needs. During our conversations, we've also heard some questions about, what is it that renters can do? A lot of these strategies require that you own property to implement them on your property, right? So we're thinking about ways we can talk about what renters might be able to do, what tenants might be able to do. And then another question that has come up is, how can residents get involved in policy change? It's really interesting, but, a lot of people don't feel that they're experts. And so maybe that's something that we can help with in terms of not just educating you about the topic, but helping you figure out how best to use your power as a resident and voter to advocate for the changes that you want to see. So what I'd like to ask again is, what else would you like to know more about? Something, whether I've mentioned it or not, what is it that rises to the top? Are there any skills that you'd like to work on that we could help facilitate in this group? You've been recruited from across the watershed, and we'd really like to empower you. We want to make sure that we are supporting you in your work. Would it be helpful to do a town meeting 101? I'm not sure how many of you are involved in town meeting in your towns. Could we talk more about what messages you think would resonate most with your organizations or your constituencies or your neighbors? So that's sort of the question I wanna ask before we get into the presentation is, do you have any ideas or have you been thinking about anything about how we can use this group to help support the work that you're already doing? And I'll open it up for comment at that point. Anyone? And if you don't want to say it, you can put it in the chat. We will have a table at Westwood Day. Maybe we can team up. Who's going to be there from us? Susanna and Jenny Goosen. So yes, look for us at Westwood Day. I'm sure they would share some brochures. We've got a couple of informational brochures and flyers about some climate resilience topics. So. Anyone else with any burning issues that you'd like to talk about in this group?
Sharon has a problem with Lake Massapog, which again this year had a lot of algae blooms.
Yes.
And had to be shut down repeatedly, which is not new. But it seems to be increasing. I guess that's not necessarily climate related.
It may be. We're getting heavier rains that wash more things into the lake. And actually, we're working with the Lake Management Committee on another project. It's another MVP and other grant-funded project that we're hoping to help with and sort of find some ways to build some green infrastructure to help capture that water so that all of those chemicals and things are not running directly into the lake. And we'll be at Sharon Day if you are around, and we'll have information about that project there. We're everywhere. Sounds like there's a Doyle Park Day, Saturday, October 5th. We'll be there too. Sustainable Milton, a green fair and green up. When is? So we are doing a a river-wide cleanup on September 28th. But Sita, if you want to send us information about your event, will be in the spring, okay. Nope, it's gonna be in the spring. Great. And Jan, I am not sure if the lake has been checked for cyanobacteria.
Thanks, because they have a problem with that with the several lakes on the Cape, and they have to check them periodically.
Yeah, I'm not sure if the Department of Public Health has done that in Sharon, have they?
It has been, it's part of the drive
Okay.
for some of the beach closures.
Okay.
There's also another question in here in the chat.
Oh.
See it? Also the Neponset Trail where,
Oh, sorry, that's what I was talking about. Oh, the Neponset Trail.
Neponset Trail where I run regularly seems to get a lot of trash along the path to the water.
We can't hear that.
Yeah, we're
Oh, sorry. So it's from the chat. The Neponset Trail seems to get a lot of trash along the paths and the water. And so Sita asks, how can we collaborate and support keeping the areas clean and clear? So we do organize 2 big cleanups during the year. I don't know if we end up in that area behind in the trail. But Paul, you're on here. Why don't can we add that to the list of places that we maybe look at for the spring
Yeah, absolutely.
as a potential location?
And I would say in general, in any of the cities or towns, we're actually struggling to find enough trash to match up with volunteers, particularly like really juicy big trash. So if anybody has suggestions of some place that needs to be cleaned up, let us know, because Paul and our other staff who work on that would be thrilled.
Can you repeat what he's
Yes,
saying?
I'm going to repeat it. Yes. So, so Ian was saying that we've been doing these cleanups for a while, and we're actually struggling to find places with a lot of trash. There are plenty of places with trash, but a lot of it is real small. We can't pick it up. And so if you know of a place that does have trash that needs a cleanup, please contact us, shoot us an email, because we are always looking for places for those 2 major cleanups, but we also do cleanups with, with corporate groups and community organizations as sort of one-offs. And so we're always looking for those places. So please keep us in mind when you see those places.
I'll also point out that, and I know you'll repeat this for people online, there's a group meeting up with DCR along the Truman Parkway and that whole area that she's talking about, so maybe that's something to bring up with them. Other times than the river cleanups, we are really concerned about the trash.
Is that the Greenways
Yes.
group?
Yeah.
Okay, so what Karen was saying is that there is a group that's meeting regularly to talk about the expansion of the Greenway Trail. So right along Truman Highway is one of the spots, and so that might be another outlet, another group to talk about some of these issues with, and maybe we could collaborate with some additional groups.
So September 30th.
Oh, September 30th is the next meeting. Any questions, you can email Karen. All right, we're getting some sites in the chat, which is great.
I don't know if you saw Carrie in the chat, Jean's comment about the Norwood Town Manager and
No,
stormwater fee.
I did not see that.
And I think we've
I'm still not seeing it.
according to the agenda, we may be almost done with this part of the discussion.
Yep.
I was gonna suggest, we should have switched the audio back so people could hear each other, but at this point, I'm not sure we want to make that change. So the question is, Norwood Town Manager floated the idea of a stormwater fee to support resilience projects that was shut down. Residents called it a tax, so it's not directly, and I think everyone in Newark needs to know, our full watershed needs to implement projects that will have money.
Yes, I support the stormwater fee. So yes, I'd be happy to talk to you about that. Milton and Dedham are 2 towns in our watershed that have already implemented this fee, and it's so helpful in terms of providing dedicated funding for maintaining stormwater infrastructure, as well as all of the operations that go into protecting our waters and keeping our streets clearer.
Could you clarify what that fee is, please?
So in Norwood, the proposal was for a fee based on the amount of impervious surface you own. So, but residents had one rate, commercial had another. I don't have all the details in front of me, but all of those funds would go into an enterprise fund that could only be used for actually it was limited to capital stormwater projects. So maintaining the infrastructure, making sure that everything is working properly, upgrading infrastructure where you need to for, to increase capacity for some of the heavier rains we're getting.
So
This
that
is-
actually was passed by Dedham and Norwood?
No, Dedham and Milton.
Dedham, and so that is in place?
Yes,
Wow.
And it was based on impervious surface.
yes.
So areas where the stormwater was going to pick up pollutants and run more directly to local water bodies.
Right, so a
I've-
commercial parking lot, a commercial large parking lot was gonna pay more,
Right, even a church parking lot like
Sure.
St. Tim's.
yes. But we can talk more about that at another meeting. I do wanna make sure that we get you out of here on time. So I would encourage you to keep putting anything in the chat that you think of that we can be helping you with, that we can be supportive of your work, things you want to learn more about, to feel like you are empowered to go out and talk to your constituents about climate resilience building. So keep putting those in the chat, and I'm going to turn it over to Barry. You should come up here.
Definitely come up, and I apologize, I didn't realize this group was such a bunch of lively conversations. We should have switched the audio back. It's, when the speaker's speaking, it's better if it's up there, but when we go to discussion, we'll switch it back.
All right. Just as a sound check, can everybody hear me okay online?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, thank you for the chance to join you all as part of the meeting tonight too. It sounds like you've been touching on a lot of important resilience topics too. And I think about the last piece that Carrie talked about there, and this idea of maybe what does it mean for folks to get more civically engaged and more civically involved. And one of those spaces that can do it is around climate resilience and how we're dealing with climate change ourselves and participating in it too. And so I'm going to talk about a piece of work that we were involved with in the towns of Natick and Ashland and the city of Framingham, who are doing this work collectively too. And we did that work and actually still continue to do that work under the title of the Metro West Climate Equity Project. Not unlike yourselves, our work started with a municipal vulnerability preparedness action grant. We started ours back in the fall of 2021 too. And as I mentioned, it's across these 3 municipalities. And when I think across a watershed, for example, you have a mix of cities and towns that are quite different, right? Like you have different characteristics, different land use going on, different things around transportation and natural resources. And so we had a mix of that across these 3 municipalities, to some place that's not as developed and built, to a very, very large city in the case of Framingham too. When we did this work, we really wanted to be explicit by leading with equity. And often in the public health world too, we're tending to think specifically about health equity. And we think about that as driven by sometimes what we'll call the social determinants of health. It's not how many times you see a doctor, it's not the genetics. At an individual level, maybe that, but at a community level, it's a whole lot more about what are the economic opportunities in your life? What is your neighborhood like? What are those things essentially that are both either supporting or potentially discriminating you in terms of holding you back in the health that you may have? And so to do that work, we set 3 goals in going into this project, is that we wanted to build lasting relationships, particularly in the neighborhoods that met environmental justice criterias, with that idea that essentially it's something that we then continue to move on and continue to flourish through the work too. We wanted to learn from the community about their experience of climate change and then use that information in many cases to update climate planning efforts that had already happened, but in many cases didn't bring in these voices or didn't create the spaces where people could really participate in some of these conversations, and then really build the understanding within municipal staff of what it means to do this kind of work of relationship building and reaching out to people as part of it. We really liked this definition, and can't say like we always speak it explicitly, but it's a definition we come back to a lot about community-driven planning. And it's this idea that the planning is a process by which residents of vulnerable and impacted communities define for themselves the challenges to face and the solutions most relevant to their unique assets and threats. Two things to highlight from that definition is the fact that residents and places are defining those challenges. I think all of us have probably experienced, if we're in a city or town or a community, somebody is telling us what the problem is or kind of telling us what that issue should be. And often it's a different process to surface that directly from residents. And then secondly, also to realize that there's a set of assets that we can draw upon and think about within that process. So it's not all just idea that everything is wrong and that there's all problems in all this. Like this distinction too that we try to make, kind of go further in detail around that too, is that often we think about traditional planning processes, it's the city or town that's engaging residents in these areas that they think about. What's the public meeting? What's the survey we're gonna do? Asking for residents to volunteer their time in order to provide feedback. So the city or town provides the idea, provides the question, and they just ask for people to show up and provide that voluntarily. Often what is being valued in the room is the municipal or the academic expertise. The knowledge is assumed to be sitting in those professionals who that is their job. It tends to emphasize planning, and I'll talk about that in contrast in a second. And it also presumes that any process we're engaged in is going to go from A to B to C to D. And again, I'm sure that's probably creating feelings in yourselves if you've been part of any process. Very rarely does it follow the alphabet that way. And so when we think about a community-driven planning model, what we talk about is how our residents themselves in that process engaging neighbors and other community members in mutually convenient ways too. So maybe it's somebody's living room where that conversation happens to. Maybe it's at a particular park where people cross paths all the time as part of that too. It's a model when we think about within this liaison model that members who are participating and acting in that project are compensated for their time. It's one where community expertise is prioritized and supported by that technical expertise. So when we talk about or use that term lived experience, that is on the table just as much as somebody who might be coming with a degree. Like that is what's being valued in that conversation. We tend to have a focus on if we have an idea, how do we act on it? And by acting, learn about it, as opposed to just plan on it. And getting in that idea that we may have to go A to B, back to A to B before we get to C. So we really get through that process. And when we do that, we really try to hold up these 5 values within the work. I should have said at the beginning too, I think a lot of what I'm talking about here is probably not new to anybody, and what we're really presenting to you today is the way we've tried to combine this information in our work. One is around power sharing. You can see some of that in how we were talking about expertise, that idea if we're going to come up with an idea, we're going to figure out how to approach it. How are we sharing that in a way where everybody can sit at the table in a way where power is being shared? Mutual respect for experience and expertise kind of brings that home even more. So when someone shares their particular expertise, and just to highlight this one as an example, we were doing some work in one of these towns, and we knew that an area that had environmental justice characteristics had raised up this flag that a particular area is really, really dark at night. And so they wanted it to be a little bit more lit. Rather than essentially kind of looking at the expertise of how they may approach that in the neighborhood, the city came through and cut down a bunch of trees. That was not what was being asked for, but that's how it was interpreted, right? So that expertise in terms of what could happen in that particular place. It's informed decision-making. So again, bringing these pieces of information together in a way that we know what is the decision we're going to make, what are the parameters, as opposed to people are ready to make a decision if they get information 10 minutes in advance, right? How do we do that too? Looking for every opportunity to have involvement in the process too. So not picking and choosing when we involve people, but if we're gonna start it, are we focused on the right issues? If we're gonna make a way to both kind of share and collect information, are we doing that in an involved way? And then lastly, trying to keep this all in the pace of relationship building. And this has been one of the areas I think is a value for us that's really pushed our team in doing this work, because what it means is when you're outside of that meeting, you might be getting a phone call from someone who might need food the next day. You might be getting a call from someone essentially who's looking to make a connection with a neighbor and having trouble. You may actually be having trouble with a solar installer who may have taken advantage of them. How do you connect them, right? So it brings in these other pieces where you're actually seeing the whole person when you've invited the whole person into that process. I'm going to talk a little bit too about some of the bright spots and lessons learned, but just to give you some characteristics of what has gone into the work. I think as was noted earlier at the top, this idea of thinking about how do we bring in a public health approach and thinking about health equity. And often when we're saying the public health approach, what we're talking about is seeing the human being. I think a lot of climate conversations, for better or worse, sometimes focus on just nature and just infrastructure, and those people that are existing in between don't always necessarily get the recognition. The use of the concept of popular education, co-designing outreach materials, embracing intersectionality, and thinking about how we create inclusive spaces. So here's an example of talking about integrating health equity. And so like in addition to presenting people where there might be greater exposure from heat or greater exposure from flood, we actually brought in some of these information around where do we have higher rates of chronic disease? Where are there places where we actually see maybe kind of more different hazardous health exposures happening into a particular place? Overlaying that with kind of exposures and risk factors that really embrace what's happening in the human side of it too. Bringing this recognition to, though we may all be experiencing the same storm, we are not all in the same boat, and continuing to lift up and hold up to that particular message. And then when we talk about climate change, maybe talking about what those things mean in terms of people's lives. And so if we are talking about extreme heat, yes, that means things are going to happen in different settings, but if we think about somebody who might be an outdoor worker, what's that actually happening in their lives, and how do we think about that particular part of it? We use the popular education model here too, which really presumes a bunch of things, is that everybody in the room is bringing knowledge and expertise. It also presumes that people are there to do something practical with both the knowledge they have and the knowledge that they're going to help create. And it's also a way, again, to engage people by presuming that there's also just a lot of reasons why people are there to really enjoy each other's company. And so one activity you'll see in the upper right corner there is using a climate jeopardy activity where we kind of work through that question and response to kind of play through what does it mean around some of these things, rather than presuming we can just deliver that information as here's a thing for you to know, versus kind of interacting around that information in a really fun way too. It's also an area too where we can begin to kind of shape behaviors that we think we're asking about. So when people are like, we don't think people get enough emergency alerts, we start having those questions of like, well, who actually here signed up? And we begin to learn that we're not just presuming, but what is our experience in the room as well too. And then I think really the biggest part of this process is really spending a lot of time in what we call co-design. In the Metro West Climate Equity Project too, we spent a lot of time building relationships with folks, I think not unlike what's happening here, and did that in a way that both asked for essentially kind of their participation with an idea that we had, seeking commitment with them, both in terms of what we are going to deliver in the time that we're going to ask of them, but also what we'll ask for them to deliver for us. And then when we set up that space, spending time to learn, very much like you have here, what's it like here in this particular place and in the context of climate? What does it mean to experience that particular part of it too? And so we spent a lot of time just understanding what does it mean to cope in the current situation, beyond just saying essentially it's getting hotter. What are people doing in their lives? What do people see their neighbors or family members doing? And then we came to a point where we wanted to know more about what others, particularly those who are living in neighborhoods that met environmental justice criteria, what essentially their experiences were like as well. And so with the liaisons, we went through these conversations of essentially how do we want to do that? We didn't presume a survey was the way to do that. We had a lot of conversations about what that would be. And so we ended up really arriving at like a question set that people could use if they wanted to as a survey, they could use as a set of an interviews, and they could use as a set of group conversations. And you can see some of these methods we use there to work our way through that. One of the really fun things in here too is we only thought we were going to do one round of information collection, but what we found out when we looked at that information is that none of the liaisons felt we had the right detail. Like we may have knew of how many people thought about climate in their lives, or may have thought people were doing that, but we just wanted to know more why. And so we then worked with the liaisons to actually set up a set of action-based conversations to go deeper in that particular part. And it didn't come from us as potentially the project backbone, but from the residents wanting to learn more about others in their lives too. And so it was a really wonderful experience for us too. For me, it was one of the few times too where I participated in a lot of conversations that were not in English. And so just to sit there and be able to take in that environment, have somebody interpret for me to understand my particular place and what I could kind of understand in that, but just have those conversations, like I said earlier, happen in a place that's kind of mutually convenient in those particular ways. Here's an example of what we ended up in terms of the data collection toolkit that liaisons had asked for too. So I would say the only thing that we ended up thinking about is that there was this possibility of something being like a survey that they would use, but we kept hearing these questions of, okay, that's great, we might do that, but I want an FAQ, something I can go to when I need to talk to people more about this, how I'm going to answer questions. It'd feel really official if we actually had a name badge and we're going out to talk to people to say, hey, can you do this survey? And so we ended up on the fly creating name badges that had each of the municipalities' insignia on that particular part of it too. People also thought too, well, we want our community to be aware that we're going to be out doing these surveys, even if we're doing them. So can we also do postcards to let everybody know we'll be out there doing that particular part of it too? And then I think as important, a lot of these processes, that idea of essentially kind of having incentives for people to participate. And then at least at that time in the areas where we're doing this work, there was a really predomination of both kind of Spanish and Brazilian Portuguese speaking population. So making sure everything was available in all three of those languages. Just some points here to kind of wrap up this part of it too. So we really thought it was our liaisons that made this project successful too. They helped essentially kind of having clear expectations right from the front, both about what their compensation would be, what the role would be. Say we're asking for 30 hours, honoring that we're only asking for 30 hours of that particular part of it too. And really the relationships through a lot of community-based organizations were really critical to this particular part. One of the things that I hang my hat on a lot in this process too is that when we looked at the end of the day, most people who participated and gave information to the process came in via liaison. I think it was like 30 to 40% of people who participated in this came in that particular route as they spread it in their communities. But even more so, we ended up essentially with a representative sample across all three municipalities. And that's not something that happens often in these processes, particularly if you're thinking about race, ethnicity, age, those types of things. We spent a lot of time, again, sounds like you are here as well too, really spending a lot of time on relationship building too. And so that idea that we can't imagine that we'll be going on a project within a month, like we gave ourselves 2-3 months to really build up and do that particular part of the work too. This feeling too, that survey still wasn't the right tool as part of all this too, but that's where we landed in conversations with the liaisons. But then we really found those conversations were the places where we got the richer sets of information, the things that people felt were really kind of engaging them in the process, and also allowed people to ask those other questions they had as part of this overall process. So not just the questions we had, but the questions that participants wanted to ask us. And then lastly, again, just reinforcing this kind of time part of it too, both for relationship building, but when we think about that informed decision-making, not rushing any of those decisions, but getting to a place where everybody feels comfortable with the topic that we're going to talk about, and essentially the decisions we might go forward in all that part of it too. So hopefully that just gives you an overview of a little bit of the work we did to the liaisons model. And I think really bringing it tonight was just to give you an example of what that looked like in action and some of the elements that we built into it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Should we switch the other mode?
Switch over to-
Sure.
Yeah.
And then I'll move the audio.
Stop the recording at this point?
No, not just yet. Well, first, does anybody have any questions for Barry?
If none are coming up, I have one. Just that in a lot of our grants, we're writing in compensation for community liaisons and participants. Have those been a part of this Metro West model as well?
Yeah, and so we've been really fortunate both in that initial grant to write them in, but we're now in our 4th liaison cohort and have been able to kind of make that a part of all of them. And I'd say for at least 3 rounds, we maintained a similar set of liaisons, although we had some changes. And then more recently, we've been doing it with a group of older adults to really focus on how older adults are focusing on dealing with some of these issues. And just really learning the interesting differences about kind of like thirst and experiences of heat and essentially living with chronic disease as an older adult, as many of us will, that part of it too. So yeah, it's been really, really great to have that as part of it and keep that as part of it. Yeah, thanks.
Yes. We do have a question in the chat too. Sure.
So Janet asks, if the questionnaire is not the perfect tool, do you think that a mailing of cards with a QR code and a link will help to make it better?
We heard really throughout the process, and so particularly with a focus on making sure our primary outreach is happening in neighborhoods that met environmental justice criteria. And we're using that frame because often those are the neighborhoods that don't receive the attention, nor essentially I think often get the kind of civic engagement or not responsive to some of the spaces. We've heard a lot of interest in kind of in-person physical materials versus digital materials too. And so in this last round with older adults in having the conversations, it really became older adults having a set of questions that they chose how to kind of do that work too. And some worked with their councils on aging and did a multilingual survey and distributed that and had that in person with other adults. Others convened focus groups and held those same conversations too. And so I think in some ways it felt like the format could be a bit varied. You kind of had a sense of what those core pieces are you wanted to learn and share about, but we definitely did not hear a desire for digital engagement. We heard much more kind of in-person physical materials. Thank you for the question.
And there's another one. Susanna.
Suzanne asks, are there any plans to translate materials into other languages, such as Haitian Creole?
Yeah, so in the latest round too, the language is expanded to simplified Chinese, Russian, and Haitian Creole. So a lot of the materials are being made available in those first two languages, Spanish and Portuguese, as well as the other three too. So we can begin to have more folks be able to participate in those particular ones. Again, and really the wonderful thing too, and this is really credit to the liaisons, we really sought out and asked if people were willing to participate if they were bilingual. And so we've really been lucky too, where those liaisons have really served themselves as interpreters across the process too. And so where the survey may have a limitation or the question may have a limitation, the liaisons often play a really important role from both a kind of linguistic but also outreach perspective. So again, really credit to them to being willing to participate that way. Yeah.
All right, any other questions? I don't see
Can
any
I
more.
ask a question?
Yes, of course you can ask a question.
So in recruiting, how did you go about sort of recruiting? So I can make a narrower question. So in recruiting liaisons, did you run into situations where, you know, you were trying to connect with people of a certain demographic or certain bilingual people, yet you were constrained in your budget to be able to sort of compensate everybody who was interested? Was that a problem, or did it not really become an issue?
At least we didn't encounter it, but I do think there was a lot of intentionality in terms of like our description of who we wanted to recruit as a liaison and the particular places we wanted to do that outreach to. And so we did make choices to essentially kind of offer to some people and not other people as we went in the process too. And that was really cognizant that I think some folks we just had a sense weren't familiar and never really felt like they had a chance to participate in some of these processes. And so that feeling is kind of creating an avenue and a platform for that particular part of it. And again, we were fortunate enough to anticipate that none of this was going to happen quickly. And so I don't think we put ourselves in a position where we had to rush. We started in May, and by July we had to have people on board. We kind of gave our time to breathe and learn that. And it was particularly true with older adults, where in the process we ended up connecting with somebody who was like technically a resident of Milford, but she spent almost all of her time working with the faith-based community of older adults and training them. And so it was like that discovery period led to some really unique combinations too. And I think whenever we went along the process, folks who had expressed interest who weren't liaisons, we made sure that they were sharing information with them and keeping up to date on the process. So that's part of it.
There is an echo. They're hearing online. Yeah, Molly, I'm not even my computer isn't even connected to the audio anymore.
No worries. I just saw it too unmuted, so I thought maybe that might help with the.
So there's also a simple question from G, which is translating our acronyms. CBO.
So weird. I am not seeing any James Jens.
Yeah, Oh, you know, it was a direct message. Sorry.
Oh.
I guess she was
That's the
probably
second
hoping for a response in the chat. I'm sure other people are wondering the same thing.
So what was the question?
CBO, what's it stand for?
Oh, community-based organization.
Apologies for these backgrounds.
Yes,
Good call,
I
good
did the
call.
same thing,
Yeah.
yes.
Thank you.
And I wanted to say that actually I wanted to send that question to you, Carrie, but I couldn't find you on the distribution list. So I sent it to Ian because he popped up. So anyway, thank you.
Share things with me sometimes.
Eventually.
All right, so we are gonna move into our discussion phase. And Ian is gonna put a link in the chat if he has not already done so, but we have created a very short Google form. And we would just like for you to take 5 minutes to sort of reflect on the information that Mary has shared, and put down your thoughts on that form and submit it before we talk about any of this with anybody else. So just take 5 minutes and then we'll talk about them with in small peer groups, but if you could do that first, that would be great.
If you're in the room, you can do it the high-tech way with
Yes.
QR code, or we have actual pencils,
Right.
which also work. So, your choice.
Sorry, can I provide a little context too?
Yes, yes, please,
So,
please.
yeah, so these questions are hopefully set up in a way to where, just to see what you may have connected with, it may only have been one thing, if anything, and what was shared there too, so just doing this individually too. I think throughout our liaison process and other things too, is just that from that asset perspective, like there may be experience or expertise that you have in the work and group that you're already part of or that you're representing today. So thinking about that and what you might bring to it too. And again, if there's anything here that resonates and you have some of that expertise, what is it something that could potentially live or be part of either the work you do or connected to some of these efforts should really exist in the larger piece of it. So just some context for that as you think about it as an individual and before you kind of share out with others. So thank you.
Yes, no, thank you.
Person had to leave. I'm supposed to be bringing breakout groups, right? Thank you for that reminder. Online people, get ready for breakout groups of 2.
Got it.
So
Get the Google form.
So for everyone on the Zoom, Ian put the link to the Google form in the chat in case you're on your phone and you can't take a picture of the QR code, or you want to use the link in there to get to the first part to share your feedback thoughts.
and actually, before we put the online folks into rooms, you want to grab that link because it won't be there once I stick you in the room. So I'm going to open the rooms and you'll be able to move yourself.
And when you do move into those rooms, don't move into a room until after you've submitted the Google form, but when you move into those rooms, just share with the person who's in your room, sort of what those reflections have been, and we'll do that for about 8 minutes, and then we'll regroup as a larger group and share it.
We have access to these once we submit them?
We will.
Right, but
We
we
won't
won't
have,
remember.
yeah, just, you should remember what you, yes.
That's very presumptive of you.
And can we allow to sort of walk around?
Yes, they are actually in rooms right now, although it says some people have joined.
Ian, would you like me to be able to hop around the online rooms too, or just go to the room 6?
Well, I put you in room 6 because Sita's in room 6 by herself right now.
Oh, I will join.
Lonely. And Suzanne is also Cynthia. Suzanne is also a little bit. Excellent.
Ian, could you send me an invite to, I believe you sent it to room 4. I just somehow can't get back to it.
Okay. So you
Or
lost the invitation. Here, I'm gonna move you into room 3, Paul.
Okay.
Ian, you invited me, this is Jean, to room 7, and I just don't see it on my screen now.
Yeah, I don't see room 7 either. Let me find a good place to put you. Hold on.
I'll go anywhere, and I just finished the questionnaire, that's why I'm a bit late.
Let's put you in. I'm gonna put you in with Jen.
Okay,
That work?
sure.
Izzy says she's trying to get back in to the main room.
I need like 3 screens.
Now. Make me a host, I can help.
Sure. That's so clever.
Do you want to reflect on any of these questions or curious?
Let's see her trying to get into it.
Oh. Is it model that you have to, is it also Harvard or? Yeah. Is that model or thing that you all ever use?
It's funny that she doesn't look like she's knocking on the door.
No, I don't see a picture.
Was that a while?
It is. It's interesting though, because we have like, we have different sort of departments that work on different things.
It's
So-
like everybody is now.
People that are just working
All right.
everywhere, but
So let's stop recording and let's get Kalima and Julia together as a pair to discuss